If you look really closely at, well, the architecture of our modern lives, there's this profound and honestly almost comical contradiction.
Right, it's everywhere once you start looking for it.
Yeah, exactly. Because on one hand, we are completely obsessed with optimization. I mean, we build these rigid Cartesian grids for our cities, right?
We do. We manage our time in like 15-minute digital calendar blocks.
And we quantify our sleep cycles. We worship at the altar of data-driven decision-making. We build these massive, intricate, rational structures, basically, to keep the unpredictability of the universe at bay.
But then, almost involuntarily, we rebel against our own engineering.
We totally do. We seek out experiences that just completely shatter that order. We pack into dark, deafening clubs to lose ourselves in aggressive music, or, we fall into destructive, irrational romances.
Or we just immerse ourselves in art that forces us to confront the darkest, most terrifying aspects of human suffering.
It's like we spend all week building this elaborate psychological fortress and then the weekend trying to burn it down.
Have you ever wondered why we actually need both? Like, why do we need meticulously organized spreadsheets and wild, unpredictable weekend parties just to stay sane?
Well, that tension, it isn't a bug in the human operating system. It is the fundamental architecture of our consciousness.
Okay, so it's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. We are attempting to balance two completely antagonistic forces that are simultaneously demanding dominance over our psyche. And today's deep dive is all about decoding that exact duality.
And we've got a really rich stack of sources for this one. We're looking at comprehensive encyclopedia entries, some really dense philosophical histories,
right,
and the notoriously pessimistic ontology of Arthur Schopenhauer.
Plus, most importantly, the explosive, career-ruining text published by a 27-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche in 1872.
Right, The Birth of Tragedy. Yes. Our mission today is to take this framework, which actually began as an analysis of ancient Greek theater, and show you how it perfectly maps onto your own neurobiology, your creative process, and honestly, the invisible cultural wars happening around you right now.
We are, of course, talking about the Apollonian and the Dionysian, but a quick word of warning before we dive in, we are totally bypassing the high school mythology version of these gods.
Oh, absolutely. Forget the cartoon versions.
Right, because anyone who has opened an encyclopedia knows Apollo is associated with the sun and Dionysus with wine. But that surface-level reading is entirely insufficient for what Nietzsche was actually doing here.
Yeah, Nietzsche took these mythological figures and basically weaponized them into psychological categories. He used them to describe the absolute limits of human perception.
So let's start with Apollo. In Nietzsche's framework, Apollo isn't just like a guy with a lyre. He represents the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation.
And that principle of individuation is the absolute bedrock of how we experience reality. It is the cognitive boundary that separates you from the rest of the universe.
Which is pretty wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, when you look around a room, you don't perceive a chaotic, swirling mass of subatomic particles.
Even though physics tells us that is exactly what's actually there.
Right. But your brain organizes all that visual data into distinct, separate objects. There's a chair, there's a table, there's another human being.
So Apollo is the personification of that cognitive boundary drawing.
Exactly. He is the force of form, structure, proportion, and spatial temporal logic. He's the reason we can navigate the world without being completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated volume of sensory input.
Which means Apollo is essentially the architect of illusion, because those boundaries, while practically necessary for us to avoid, walking into traffic, are ultimately arbitrary constructs of our own nervous system.
That's a great way to put it. The universe doesn't actually care where the table ends and the floor begins.
Right. And Nietzsche associates this Apollonian force with the physiological state of dreaming. But he isn't talking about the narrative chaos of a dream, right? Like, he's talking about the phenomenological experience of the dreamer.
Yes, the experience of having the vision. When you are asleep, experiencing a vivid, beautiful dream, you are entirely surrounded by an illusion of your own mind's making.
And crucially, deep down, you maintain the awareness that it is an illusion. You are observing these phantom forms. You might feel a rush of emotion, but the you remains intact.
You're separated from the images you are watching, like sitting safely in a theater. The Apollonian dream state allows us to experience profound beauty and form while maintaining our individual safety.
We are the spectator, fundamentally insulated from the raw, dangerous reality of the thing we are perceiving.
And that insulation is exactly what Dionysus comes to destroy.
Oh man, here we go. So if Apollo is the force that draws the boundary lines, Dionysus is the primordial flood that just washes them completely away.
Completely. In the Dionysian state, the principium individuationis completely collapses.
And Nietzsche associates this with intoxication. But again, we have to elevate this beyond a simple hangover.
Way beyond a hangover. Intoxication here means the absolute annihilation of the individual ego. It is the terrifying, ecstatic moment when you cease to be a separate observer.
You just merge completely with the swirling, chaotic, undifferentiated mass of existence, which sounds kind of awesome, but also horrifying.
It's the ultimate paradox of human psychology. The loss of the self induces absolute terror because, well, the ego's only job is self-preservation. When the boundaries dissolve, the you essentially dies.
But simultaneously, as Nietzsche points out, that dissolution triggers a feeling of ecstatic, universal unity, like when you get lost in a mosh pit.
Or when you're in the middle of a massive synchronized crowd, whether it's a religious ritual or a violent riot, the isolation of being a lonely, separate individual just vanishes.
You tap into something ancient, raw, and completely indifferent to your personal safety. So the Dionysian is the underlying reality of nature before the Apollonian brain chops it up into manageable pieces.
Precisely. And I think it's important to ask you, the listener, to reflect on your own tendencies here. Do you crave the Apollonian clarity of a planned schedule?
Or do you seek out the Dionysian thrill of completely losing yourself in music, or maybe a really passionate argument? We all lean one way or the other.
But the genius of the ancient Greeks, according to our sources, was that they didn't view these two forces as a moral binary.
Right. This isn't a theological battle where Apollo is the good angel of reason and Dionysus is the evil demon of chaos.
Not at all. They recognize that a purely Apollonian life is sterile, rigid, and ultimately disconnected from the vital energy of the universe.
But a purely Dionysian life is sheer madness, right? I mean, it is a rapid descent into self-destruction and orgiastic violence. You can't just live in the mosh pit.
You'd never survive. So the Greeks understood these forces had to be held in a state of constant, agonizing tension.
Which is a perfect segue, because to truly understand why Nietzsche needed this framework and why he applied it to art, we have to look at the philosophical climate he was writing in.
We have to introduce the shadow that hangs over this entire analysis.
The profoundly depressing mentor he was trying to argue against, Arthur Schopenhauer.
Oh, Schopenhauer. Nietzsche was this brilliant, highly sensitive young academic. And when he discovered Schopenhauer's masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, it profoundly infected his worldview.
Infected is the right word,
Yeah.
because Schopenhauer offers arguably the most bleak, unrelenting, pessimistic diagnosis of existence in the history of Western philosophy.
He really does.
Yeah.
So let's lay out Schopenhauer's ontology, because it is the engine of this entire deep dive.
Right. Schopenhauer believed that the underlying reality of the universe, the thing humming beneath the Apollonian illusion of time, space, and separate objects, is something he called the will.
But we have to be super careful not to anthropomorphize this will. It isn't a conscious God making decisions.
No, it is a blind, purposeless, insatiable, churning force. It is the raw drive to exist, to consume, and to reproduce, just utterly devoid of logic or ultimate meaning.
And because this will is blind and purposeless, it is in a state of constant, agonizing deficiency. It always wants, but it can never be permanently satisfied.
And because it is the essence of all things, everything in the universe is locked in a brutal zero-sum war for survival. The animal tears the flesh of another animal.
The human exploits the other human. The underlying fabric of reality is just the will devouring itself endlessly.
So Schopenhauer concludes, the baseline state of all existence is suffering. Happiness is just a temporary negative state.
Yeah, it is merely the fleeting absence of pain before the will demands something else, which leads to a pretty chilling conclusion.
He literally determines that life is fundamentally a mistake. It is an error that should never have happened.
And this isn't just like edgy 19th century posturing. Our sources highlight how deeply Nietzsche internalized a specific, horrific piece of ancient Greek mythology to embody this pessimism.
The wisdom of Silenus. Silenus was this mythical half-beast companion of Dionysus, and the story goes that King Midas hunted Silenus down in the forest, captured him, and demanded to know what was the absolute best and most desirable thing for mankind.
And the response Silenus gives is the purest distillation of Schopenhauerian despair.
It's brutal. He laughs at the king and says, "Oh, wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear?
What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach. Not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon."
Not to be born or to die soon. I mean, wow, that is the abyss Nietzsche is staring into. He fully accepts Schopenhauer's premise.
He does. He accepts that the underlying reality, the Dionysian truth of the universe, is a horrific, meaningless slaughterhouse of suffering.
Wait, if Nietzsche agrees with Schopenhauer that life is fundamentally just irrational suffering, isn't Nietzsche just putting a fresh coat of paint on a sinking ship?
It looks that way at first glance, but here is the monumental pivot that defines Nietzsche's early philosophy. Schopenhauer looked at that suffering and said, the only moral response is asceticism.
Right, he said we must deny the will, starve our desires, renounce the world, seek the peace of non-existence.
But Nietzsche rejects this cowardice entirely. He desperately wants to affirm life. He wants to find a way to look directly at the wisdom of Silenus and say yes to existence anyway.
He isn't just rebranding the despair, he's offering a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
He introduces the will to power as an artistic, creative force that uses suffering as a tool for self-overcoming.
Exactly. It completely contrasts with Schopenhauer's defeatist will to life. And the mechanism Nietzsche discovers to achieve this affirmation is astonishing.
He argues that we cannot justify existence rationally. Because logically, Schopenhauer is right. The math of human suffering doesn't add up to a good deal.
And we cannot justify it morally, because the universe is fundamentally unjust. The only way to justify existence, Nietzsche proclaims, is as an aesthetic phenomenon.
We have to treat the horrifying irrational will as the raw material for a cosmic work of art.
But treating suffering as art isn't just a mental trick. It requires a specific cultural technology. And Nietzsche points to 5th century Athens and says, they built it.
The ancient Greeks actually built a cultural machine designed specifically to process the unbearable horror of existence and transform it into a profound affirmation of life.
That machine was Attic tragedy, the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles. According to the birth of tragedy, these dramatic works represent the absolute apex of human culture.
Because they achieved the perfect, miraculous fusion of the Dionysian and the Apollonian.
Exactly. And to understand how this psychological technology functioned, we have to look at the literal structure of the Greek theater.
The core of the ancient tragedy wasn't the heroic actors on the stage, it was the chorus.
Right. A group of men, often dressed as satyrs, half-goat, half-human creatures, would sing, dance, and chant to the accompaniment of raw, rhythmic music.
This chorus is the pure embodiment of the Dionysian. They are the voice of the undifferentiated will. Through their music, they express the terror, the suffering, and the chaotic ecstasy of the natural world.
So imagine you are sitting in the stone amphitheater in ancient Athens, and you are hit with the full, unmitigated force of the Dionysian chorus.
You are being exposed to the terrifying truth of your own insignificance. You are being told that your ego is a lie, and that you will be crushed by the wheel of existence.
If the play was only the chorus, the psychological weight would be unbearable. The audience would be completely paralyzed by the wisdom of Silenus.
They would walk out of the theater and drown themselves in the Aegean Sea, which is exactly why the Dionysian truth cannot be delivered raw. It requires a protective filter.
It requires the Apollonian. As the chorus chants the horrific truth of the universal will, the Apollonian elements are projected onto the stage above them.
We see the clear, structured, beautiful dialogue. We see the distinct, individualized characters like Oedipus or Prometheus.
We see a specific plot with a beginning, middle, and end. The Apollonian takes the incomprehensible, massive suffering of the entire universe and concentrates it into the specific, manageable story of one noble individual.
The mechanism here is brilliant. I like to visualize it like a total solar eclipse.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
The raw Dionysian truth of the universe is the sun. It is the fundamental source of all energy and reality, but its power is absolute and destructive. If you look directly at the sun with the naked eye, it will literally blind you.
The truth is just too bright.
Right. So the Apollonian elements of the tragedy, the myth, the poetic dialogue, the structure of the hero's journey, these are the protective safety glasses.
And the safety glasses don't block the truth, they filter it. They reduce the blinding, chaotic radiation of the will into a visible, beautiful form.
Through the Apollonian illusion of the individual hero suffering on stage, the audience can look directly into the dark heart of the Dionysian reality without having their own psychology shattered.
They experience the terror of ego dissolution, but from the safe, individuated boundary of their seat in the theater.
Which explains why we enjoy deeply tragic or horrifying movies even today. Because, as Nietzsche points out, you are experiencing the joyous, indestructible power of universal life from a safe distance.
The result of that exact intersection is the sublime. You walk into the theater carrying the existential dread of being a fragile mortal creature. You watch the hero get systematically destroyed by fate.
But because of the interplay between the music and the myth, you don't leave feeling depressed. You leave feeling an intense, vitalizing rush.
You have touched the raw, eternal power of life itself. You have faced the abyss, and you have survived it. The art form actively metabolizes Schopenhauerian pessimism into a defiant, joyous will to power.
It is a profound psychological achievement, but unfortunately, this perfect cultural technology for processing human suffering was a fragile balance.
Very fragile. The birth of tragedy is ultimately a narrative of decline. Nietzsche asserts that this synthesis of the two gods was incredibly short-lived.
The tragedy was murdered. And it wasn't destroyed by invading Persian armies or economic collapse. It was destroyed from the inside by an intellectual virus.
Nietzsche points the finger at two specific men who thought they were doing the world a favor: the playwright Euripides and the philosopher Socrates.
Now, accusing Socrates of being the villain who destroyed the greatest culture in human history is a staggeringly provocative claim.
He really is. But let's start with Euripides, because he was the symptom before Socrates became the disease.
How exactly did Euripides dismantle the technology of tragedy? According to Nietzsche, he introduced the poison of naturalism.
Euripides looked at the grand mythic plays of his predecessors and decided they were too mysterious, too irrational, and too disconnected from everyday reality.
He essentially wanted to bring the audience onto the stage. He stripped away the massive cosmic scope of the tragedy.
He drastically reduced the role of the Dionysian chorus, sidelining the music and the raw expression of nature.
And instead, he populated his plays with everyday people dealing with mundane psychological squabbles. He replaced the profound, irrational terror of the will with clever dialogue and recognizable domestic disputes.
But seeing a reflection of everyday life on stage completely defeats the purpose of the psychological machine.
Exactly. If I am plagued by the existential terror of my own mortality, watching a play about two people logically debating their marriage doesn't help me metabolize that dread at all.
It just traps you in the Apollonian surface layer. Euripides eliminated the Dionysian depth because he didn't understand them.
And he didn't understand them because he was infected by the worldview of his close associate, Socrates.
Socrates is the true target of Nietzsche's fury. Socrates represents the absolute pathological extreme of the Apollonian instinct, stripped of any connection to the natural world.
Nietzsche coins the term aesthetic Socratism, which operates on one supreme, uncompromising law. To be beautiful, everything must be intelligible.
Socrates believed that the universe is fundamentally a rational place, and that human reason logic, dialectics, the scientific method, is capable of penetrating the deepest mysteries of existence.
Okay, hold on. I have to play devil's advocate and aggressively challenge Nietzsche on this point. We are taught that Socratic logic and the scientific method are the greatest achievements of Western civilization.
Sure, they built the modern world.
Right. Dialectical reasoning, the insistence on evidence, these are the tools that eradicated smallpox, split the atom, and built the internet. How can Nietzsche possibly categorize the pursuit of logical truth as an anti-life disease? Isn't he being wildly unfair?
It's the essential question, and we really have to parse Nietzsche's critique very carefully here. Nietzsche is not denying that the scientific method can cure diseases or build bridges.
Okay, so he's not anti-science.
No, he is attacking the metaphysical arrogance of the Socratic worldview. The delusion of Socratic rationality is the belief that thought can not only understand existence, but that it can actually correct it.
Ah, I see. Socrates operated on the premise that virtue is knowledge. If we just gather enough data, if we just analyze the variables logically, we can eliminate human suffering and engineer a perfect, happy society.
Exactly. He viewed suffering as a math problem waiting to be solved, rather than the inescapable fundamental fabric of reality.
Nietzsche calls this the illusion of the theoretical man. The theoretical man believes he can logic his way out of the abyss.
But logic has limits. Reason can explain the mechanics of a tumor, but it provides absolutely no spiritual or psychological armor against the visceral, irrational agony of watching a loved one die.
By insisting that only the rational is valid, Socrates systematically eradicated the role of myth, instinct, and the Dionysian frenzy.
He convinced Western civilization that relying on primal intuition or accepting the irrational mystery of life was a primitive weakness.
So, by championing pure reason, Socrates accidentally lobotomized human culture. He stripped away the exact artistic technology that we desperately need to survive the traumas that logic cannot fix.
He left us shivering in the cold, holding a spreadsheet, utterly defenseless against the crushing weight of existential dread.
When you frame it that way, Nietzsche's diagnosis of modern decadence feels shockingly relevant. A culture without myth, passion, and the ability to process irrational suffering is fundamentally spiritually starved.
It is deeply relevant now. But in the academic climate of 1872 Germany, publishing a book that called Socrates a dangerous degenerate in ancient Greece, a culture obsessed with dark, violent pessimism, was intellectual suicide.
You might imagine that publishing a book like that would cause a stir. And you'd be right, it nearly destroyed Nietzsche's career.
We have to understand the specific idol Nietzsche was smashing. The German university system at the time worshipped the Greeks through the lens of Enlightenment-era scholars.
Yeah, the prevailing consensus was that the Greeks were the embodiment of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. They loved to view them as happy, simple, and noble. Perfectly serene, rational, unbothered marble statues.
And Nietzsche kicks down the door of the academy and says, "You're all blind. The marble statues are a desperate, terrified defense mechanism to hide the fact that the Greeks were participating in bloody rituals and staring into a void of meaningless suffering."
The establishment response was merciless. A brilliant young philologist named Ulrich von Wilamowitz Moellendorff publicly trashed the book.
He saw it as his personal duty to excommunicate Nietzsche from the academic priesthood. He published a scathing pamphlet titled Zukunfts Philology, which translates to Philology of the Future.
A very sarcastic jab at Nietzsche's ambitions.
Extremely sarcastic. Wilamowitz didn't just disagree with the philosophy, he attacked Nietzsche's methodology. He accused him of ignoring historical evidence, substituting rigorous scholarship with delusional prophecies.
He essentially told the academic world, this man is a fraud playing dress-up in the Department of Philology, and the cancellation was absolute.
Our sources detail the immediate fallout. Students literally boycotted Nietzsche's lectures. He was a professor at the University of Basel, supposedly at the beginning of a brilliant career, and suddenly he found himself standing in an empty lecture hall.
No one in his field would associate with him. But the tragedy of this book wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, and it centered entirely around his relationship with Richard Wagner.
Richard Wagner is basically the unspoken third god in The Birth of Tragedy.
Oh.
When Nietzsche wrote the book, he was heavily under Wagner's influence.
Nietzsche believed that modern European culture was dying of Socratic rationality, and he genuinely thought that Wagner's monumental mythic operas were the modern rebirth of the Apollonian and Dionysian synthesis.
He thought Wagner was the new Aeschylus, returning the raw power of music and myth to a starved civilization. Wagner's opera, Tristan and Isolde, is essentially a masterclass in Dionysian boundary dissolution.
It's a relentless, swelling, musical exploration of a love so intense that it requires the literal death of the individuals to be fulfilled. Nietzsche was intoxicated by it. He dedicated the book to Wagner.
He viewed himself as the philosophical prophet to Wagner's musical revolution. But as the years passed, the illusion shattered.
Nietzsche's intellectual trajectory required intense independence, and Wagner demanded absolute fealty. Plus, Nietzsche grew deeply disgusted by Wagner's personal ideologies.
Right, Wagner was leaning heavily into intense German nationalism, virulent anti-Semitism, and eventually a bizarre form of theatrical Christian asceticism.
Nietzsche realized that Wagner wasn't the cure for modern decadence. He was just another grotesque symptom of it, which forces Nietzsche into a profound reckoning with his own work.
Fast forward 14 years to 1886. A new edition of The Birth of Tragedy is being published, and Nietzsche writes a new preface for it.
It's brilliantly titled An Attempt at Self-Criticism, and it is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of philosophy. He mercilessly roasts his own younger self.
He really does. He describes his own masterpiece as an impossible book. He calls it badly written, ponderous, embarrassing, sentimental, and saccharine.
He attacks himself for ruining the pure Greek problem by dragging modern German music meaning Wagner into it. He mocks his own reliance on Schopenhauer's heavy, pessimistic vocabulary.
especially when he was actually trying to articulate a philosophy of radical joy. But buried beneath the intense self-flagellation, he ferociously defends the core architecture of the theory.
He admits the execution was flawed, but he insists the psychological breakthroughs were utterly correct. The duality of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the understanding that Socratic rationality is an illusion, he double downs on all of it.
He realized he had unearthed a framework that explained the fundamental mechanics of human nature far better than the sterile logic of his academic peers.
And history entirely vindicated him. While The Birth of Tragedy initially ruined Nietzsche's academic standing, his Apollonian and Dionysian framework was just too powerful to die.
It escaped the confines of classical philosophy and infiltrated almost every modern discipline. The framework of order versus chaos proved to be an irresistible analytical tool across multiple fields.
Let's trace that lineage, starting with the field of anthropology. In 1934, the prominent anthropologist Ruth Benedict published Patterns of Culture,
a foundational text in the field. She took Nietzsche's aesthetic categories and mapped them directly onto the sociological behaviors of Native American tribes.
She used the framework to argue that entire societies can organize their foundational ethos around either the Apollonian or the Dionysian impulse.
Right. She observed the Pueblo cultures of the American Southwest, specifically the Zuni people, and classified them as profoundly Apollonian.
Their society was deeply structured around harmony, restraint, and the avoidance of psychological extremes. Their rituals were meticulous and highly ordered.
They actively distrusted disruptive emotional states, individualism, or any experience that broke the measured, predictable boundaries of community life.
They built their cultural fortress out of Apollonian safety glasses. But then Benedict contrasted them with the Kwakiutl tribes of the Pacific Northwest.
And she characterized their culture as overwhelmingly Dionysian. Their societal structures valued intense, ostentatious displays of emotion, extreme excess, and the pursuit of ecstatic experiences.
Their rituals were designed to deliberately induce frenzy and rupture the ordinary constraints of daily life. Benedict basically proved that Nietzsche's aesthetic theory was actually a highly effective sociological lens.
But the utility of the framework didn't stop in the humanities. It bled over into the hard sciences, entirely bypassing the Socratic assumption that science is a purely logical endeavor.
This part is fascinating. The Nobel Prize-winning biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi famously categorized the practitioners of modern science into two distinct camps based directly on Nietzsche's gods.
Szent-Györgyi argued that the Apollonian scientist perfectly develops established lines of research. They are the master of the paradigm.
They take existing research and develop it with meticulous, rigorous, logical precision. They optimize. They draw the boundaries sharper and clearer.
But then you have the Dionysian scientists. These are the intuitive, chaotic researchers who explore the unexpected fringes of the unknown.
They don't build on the existing foundation. They rely on sudden, irrational leaps of insight to shatter the foundation completely.
Szent-Györgyi made a profound observation about the nature of discovery itself. The Apollonian refines what is known. The Dionysian discovers what is genuinely new by operating outside the boundaries of established logic.
This relates perfectly to modern workplaces. The Apollonian is the engineer meticulously optimizing the code. The Dionysian is the visionary who throws out the code entirely because they had a wild intuitive breakthrough at 3 a.m.
Both are vital for progress. But Szent-Györgyi pointed out a critical flaw in modern scientific infrastructure. They secure grants very differently.
Our grant systems and funding institutions are overwhelmingly Apollonian. They demand predictable proposals, clear methodologies, and logical outcomes. They demand a spreadsheet before they write a check.
Which means the brilliant, chaotic Dionysian intuition is structurally starved of resources because it cannot logically prove what it is going to discover before it discovers it.
The tyranny of Socrates lives on in the peer review process.
Exactly. Now, pulling all these threads together, we also must examine how this framework continues to spark intense debate in modern cultural theory.
Yes, and our sources specifically highlight the American humanities scholar Camille Paglia and her 1990 book, Sexual Personae.
And we need to explicitly state here that we are impartially reporting Paglia's gender associations exactly as presented in the source material without endorsing them.
Right, absolutely. We're highlighting how the framework is used to spark debate, not taking sides.
Paglia essentially absorbs the Apollonian and Dionysian forces and uses them as the absolute bedrock for a sweeping, highly provocative theory of Western art, culture, and gender.
She prefers to use the term chthonic instead of Dionysian. She argues that modern translations have softened Dionysus into a symbol of just, like, a wild party or mere sexual liberation.
She insists that the true Dionysian force, the chthonic, is the dark, terrifying, bloody, merciless reality of blind nature. She famously writes, "The Dionysian is no picnic."
Within her framework, Pallia maps these forces across distinct gender lines. She associates the Dionysian, the chthonic, with the female principle, linking it to the inescapable, chaotic power of nature.
In direct opposition, she maps the Apollonian onto the male principle, associating it with the drive to create structure, linear progress, clear boundaries, and the cortex.
Her central thesis is that everything we consider civilization, every building, every scientific theory, every structured piece of art, is an Apollonian revolt against the primal, chthonic mother.
Regardless of where one stands on the controversies surrounding her gender politics, Pallia introduces a fascinating biological parallel.
She takes this abstract philosophical debate and locates it directly inside human neuroanatomy. The idea that this philosophical debate is actually a neurological battle.
Yes, she suggests that the Apollonian and the Dionysian are biological imperatives fighting for dominance within our central nervous system.
The Apollonian is physically located in the higher cerebral cortex. This is the newest part of our evolutionary hardware. It's the seat of language, logic, spatial reasoning.
It is the literal biological mechanism that creates the principium individuationis.
While the Dionysian resides in the limbic system and the older reptilian brainstem, it is the deep, dark, evolutionary engine responsible for raw emotion, immediate survival instincts, and the fight-or-flight response.
The cortex attempts to build a rational society, while the limbic system screams for blood, ecstasy, and dissolution.
The battle between Apollo and Dionysus isn't just historical. It is happening inside your head right now, every time a firing synapse tries to override a primal hormone.
Which perfectly explains why a culture that relies exclusively on Socratic rationality, a culture that entirely isolates itself in the cerebral cortex, is fundamentally unstable.
The limbic system cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be permanently subdued by a spreadsheet or a logical argument.
If the Dionysian forces are not given a designated, structured outlet like the ancient Greek tragedy provided, they will eventually rupture the Apollonian boundaries with devastating, unpredictable violence.
That brings us to the core realization of this entire exploration. We started by defining the boundaries of Apollo and the terrifying, ecstatic chaos of Dionysus.
We walk through Schopenhauer's agonizing realization that the will of the universe is blind and saturated in suffering.
We saw how the young Nietzsche rejected asceticism and found salvation in the aesthetic transfiguration of tragedy, the perfect, life-affirming fusion of the illusion and the abyss.
We analyze the intellectual hubris of Socrates and Euripides, who convinced the world that human suffering could be cured through rationality alone, effectively murdering the mythic technology we needed.
We explored the brutal academic fallout of Nietzsche's claims, his break with Wagner, and his fierce defense of his own psychological insights.
And we tracked how those insights permanently reshaped anthropology, the philosophy of science, and cultural neurobiology.
The key takeaway from this massive tapestry of thought is that true health for an individual or a culture requires balancing the structured beauty of Apollo with the vital, chaotic energy of Dionysus.
You cannot permanently inhabit the Apollonian dream without becoming sterile, paralyzed, and disconnected from the vital force of reality.
And you cannot surrender fully to the Dionysian intoxication without losing your mind and your existence. True psychological health is the terrifying, exhilarating act of riding the lightning between the two.
And that leads to one final, deeply unsettling thought to ponder regarding the exact trajectory of our species right now.
We are currently engaged in the largest, most aggressive Apollonian project in human history.
We are developing artificial intelligence, predictive algorithms, and ubiquitous data surveillance. We are attempting to code Socratic rationality into the very fabric of our environment.
We are optimizing every variable to eliminate uncertainty, friction, and irrationality. We are essentially trying to build the ultimate, perfectly engineered, mathematically flawless Socratic utopia.
But if Nietzsche's diagnosis holds true, this hyper-rational Socratic architecture is fundamentally hostile to the deepest requirements of the human spirit.
Logic alone cannot justify existence. If we successfully build a world completely devoid of myth, stripped of irrational passion, and perfectly insulated from the Dionysian chaos, what happens to the human limbic system?
What happens to the deep, primordial will that refuses to be quantified? Are we engineering our own salvation, or are we simply building a massive, highly pressurized Apollonian boiler without a release valve?
Guaranteeing that when the Dionysian rebellion finally comes, it will burn the entire structure to the ground. The terrifying part is that the data won't be able to predict the explosion until the fire has already started. You need the boundaries to survive, but you need the chaos to live. Question the algorithms dictating your reality, respect the abyss beneath your feet, and keep diving deep.